January 3rd, 2026, pre-dawn in Caracas. U.S. Delta Force kicks down the door of Venezuela's presidential palace, drags Nicolas Maduro out of bed, and flies him to a warship. By morning, a sitting head of state is in a Brooklyn cell, and he's not even the biggest name on this list. These are every cartel bosses the U.S. has hunted down since Trump.
President Trump just announced on social media that Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, has been captured and flown out of the country.
Maduro and his wife are set to be arraigned on drug trafficking and weapons charges after U.S. Special Forces captured them during a surprise military operation in Venezuela early Saturday.
We're starting with the most audacious takedown in modern American history, because in 12 months, the United States didn't just hunt cartel bosses, it hunted the leader of an entire country. Nicolas Maduro had been running Venezuela for over a decade. To his supporters, he was the president. To the United States Justice Department, he was the head of the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, a state-protected cocaine pipeline that had been pumping product through the Caribbean for years. Back in March 2020, U.S. prosecutors had quietly indicted him for narco-terrorism. They accused him of partnering with Colombian guerrillas to flood American streets with cocaine. They put a $15 million bounty on his head, and then nothing happened. Maduro stayed in his palace. The indictment sat in a file. 5 years passed. Then Trump took office. In January 2025, the bounty doubled to $25 million. By August, Marco Rubio doubled it again, $50 million, for the capture of a sitting president. And that's when the noose started tightening. The U.S. Navy began deploying warships to the Caribbean, fighter jets, Marines. By September, American missiles were tearing apart speedboats off the Venezuelan coast, boats the Pentagon called narco-terrorist vessels. Trump posted the strike footage himself on social media. The body count climbed into triple digits. Oil tankers were being seized. Venezuelan airspace was choking. Trump formally notified Congress that the United States was now in what he called a non-international armed conflict with the cartels, language that gave the Pentagon legal cover to keep killing. Inside the palace, Maduro was running out of room. He moved between safe houses every night. He built a fortress at Fort Tiuna. He surrounded himself with Cuban soldiers, actual elite military advisors flown in from Havana, and members of his own intelligence service. He gave defiant speeches on state television. He vowed he would never bow to American threats. He thought he could outlast the storm. He was wrong. January 3rd, 2026. In the early hours of the morning, U.S. Special Forces hit Caracas. The operation had a name. They called it Operation Resolve. CIA officers had been on the ground for weeks, mapping his movements, identifying his sleeping locations. And when the strike came, it came everywhere at once. Military infrastructure across Venezuela hit simultaneously, while Delta Force closed in on the man himself. 32 Cuban soldiers died defending him. Cuba would later declare 2 days of national mourning. Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, were grabbed, hooded, and rushed to the USS Iwo Jima offshore. Trump posted the photo himself, a blindfolded Maduro in soundproof headphones, gray Nike sweatsuit, clutching a plastic water bottle. The most powerful man in Venezuela was reduced to a hostage on an American warship. 2 days later, on January 5th, he was arraigned in a Manhattan federal courtroom. He stood before the judge and said one sentence:
I am the president of Venezuela. I consider myself a prisoner of war. I was captured at my home in Caracas.
Then he pleaded not guilty to narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation, and possession of machine guns and destructive devices. He's now sitting in a federal detention center awaiting trial. Trump told reporters the United States would run the country until we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as Venezuela's interim leader. In the history of the war on drugs, no country had ever captured another country's sitting president and flown him out to face trial until now.
Well, developing tonight, chaos in Mexico after one of the most wanted cartel leaders in the country was killed in a military operation.
For over a decade, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was the most hunted criminal in Mexico. $15 million U.S. bounty, 300 million peso Mexican bounty. The DEA called him the most powerful drug trafficker in the world. Rival cartels called him the Ghost because he had vanished into the mountains of Jalisco and stayed vanished for years. His story was almost a cliche. Born dirt poor in Michoacan in 1966, dropped out of primary school, picked avocados as a kid, crossed illegally into the United States, got busted on drug charges, did his time, got deported back to Mexico in the early 1990s. He was nobody. Then he joined the Milenio Cartel, and something inside him clicked. When his bosses got arrested or killed, El Mencho took over. He renamed the operation Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, CJNG, and trained his sicarios like a medieval warlord. One former DEA expert described his approach as Genghis Khan style: wipe out opposition completely, leave nothing alive, let the bodies be the warning. CJNG exploded across Mexico, 21 states, then 25, then a presence in over 100 countries. They bought armed drones, rocket-propelled grenades. In May 2015, they shot down a Mexican military helicopter with an RPG, killing 9 soldiers. They posted execution videos. They cannibalized victims during Sicario training rituals. The United States designated CJNG a foreign terrorist organization in February 2025, just weeks after Trump took office. And the screws started turning. The Pentagon stood up something called the Joint Interagency Task Force Counter Cartel. CIA officers, FBI agents, military intelligence, all pointed at one man. American MQ-9 Reaper drones started flying into Mexican airspace at the request of the Sheinbaum government. They mapped his networks. They tracked his romantic partners. They watched. Then a tip came in. A close associate of one of El Mencho's girlfriends gave him up. February 20th, 2026, Mexican forces began encircling a remote property in Tapalpa, Jalisco. 2 days of careful staging. Special forces, National Guard, helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and somewhere overhead, a U.S. Predator drone watching everything in real time. February 22nd before sunrise, they moved. CJNG gunmen opened up immediately. A firefight ripped through the property. El Mencho and his inner circle ran for a wooded cabin complex up the hill. A second gun battle broke out. By the time the smoke cleared, 6 cartel members were dead. Rocket launchers had been seized, including weapons capable of downing aircraft, and Mexican Marines had found a wounded El Mencho lying with 2 of his bodyguards. He didn't make it to Mexico City. He bled out in transit. The most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere was gone. What came next was hell. CJNG retaliated across 20 Mexican states. 252 violent incidents in the first week, burning blockades on highways, businesses torched in Puerto Vallarta, convenience stores set on fire, trucks dragged across major roads to create flaming choke points they call narco bloqueos. 25 National Guard troops killed in coordinated ambushes. Over 70 people dead total before the violence finally cooled. But El Mencho was finished. The ghost was gone, and the empire he built started cracking from the top.
This morning, 4 decades after he was convicted in Mexico for orchestrating the murder of an American drug agent, one of the most notorious Mexican narco traffickers is locked in a Brooklyn jail.
Some of these manhunts took weeks, some took months. But in the case of Rafael Quintero, it took 40 years. In 1985, Rafael Caro Quintero was one of the founders of the original Mexican cartel, the Guadalajara Cartel. He was young, he was rich, and he was untouchable. Then a DEA agent named Enrique Kiki Camarena got too close to his operation. Caro Quintero ordered him kidnapped off a Guadalajara street in broad daylight. What happened to Camarena over the next 30 hours is not something we're going to describe in detail. What matters is this: when American agents finally found his body, the savagery of it shook Washington to its core. The DEA never forgot. They never moved on. Caro Quintero was caught, tried in Mexico, sentenced to 40 years. He should have died in a Mexican prison cell, but he didn't. In August 2013, after serving 28 years, a Mexican state judge ruled that Caro Quintero had been tried improperly and let him walk. The American government was furious. He was supposed to be rearrested. He wasn't. He vanished into the mountains of Sinaloa and went right back to drug trafficking. The FBI put him on the top 10 most wanted list. $20 million reward. The DEA hunted him for 9 more years. In July 2022, Mexican Marines finally caught him in a remote ranch in Sinaloa. 14 Mexican servicemen died in the operation. But here's the thing: getting him was only half the problem. Getting him to the United States was the other half. And for 2.5 years, the Mexican government quietly sat on the extradition request. The previous Mexican administration had cut off cooperation with the DEA. The paperwork went into a drawer and stayed there. Then Trump came came back to office. In January 2025, the Camarena family wrote a letter to the White House. They begged for extradition. Just weeks later, Trump threatened a 25% tariff on every Mexican import. He designated the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. The new Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, picked up the phone February 27, 2025. A military plane took off from an airstrip north of Mexico City, carrying 29 of Mexico's worst cartel figures. Caro Quintero was on board. So were the founders of the Zetas. So was the leader of the Juarez cartel. The Mexican government called it a transfer, not an extradition. They bypassed the entire treaty process to get it done before the tariffs hit. 14,631 days of hope. 40 years of agents retiring without seeing justice. 40 years of Camarena's son, now a judge in San Diego, growing up without his father. Caro Quintero walked in wearing a bright orange t-shirt under a navy smock. And here's the detail that'll give you chills. The handcuffs on his wrists were inscribed with a name, Enrique Camarena Salazar. The DEA had brought their fallen agent's handcuffs to the courtroom, a symbol older than the suspect on trial. A message that could not have been more pointed if it had been written on the wall. He's now held under the same isolation measures as El Chapo, and even though it came 40 years late, justice was still served.
Two brothers, Zeta 40 and Zeta 42, the leaders of the Zetas cartel, now known as Cartel del Noreste, are now in U.S. custody after being extradited.
Most cartels were criminal organizations. The Zetas were a paramilitary force. Miguel Treviño Morales, alias Z40, and his younger brother Omar, alias Z42, turned the Zetas into something that even other cartels were terrified of. The Zetas didn't just kill rivals. They left bodies hanging from highway overpasses. They dissolved enemies in acid. They massacred entire villages. In one infamous case, they slaughtered 72 migrants in San Fernando, Tamaulipas, just to send a message. In 2011, they ambushed and killed an American ICE agent named Jaime Zapata in Mexico. U.S. prosecutors estimated the brothers personally trafficked 45 tons of cocaine and pulled in $10 million a year in profits. They were accused of being personally responsible for dozens of murders. Mexican authorities arrested Miguel in 2013. They got Omar in 2015. The Americans immediately requested extradition, and then nothing happened. For over a decade, the brothers ran the cartel from inside Mexican prisons. Cell phones, visitors, bribes. They renamed the organization Cartel del Noreste, CDN, and kept moving cocaine, kept ordering kidnappings, kept directing torture and murder, all from behind bars. The Mexican Attorney General himself called the delay truly shameful. The United States gave up trying. They figured it would never happen. Then Trump returned, and everything changed. February 20th, 2025, the State Department officially designated CDN as a foreign terrorist organization. 1 week later, on February 27th, both brothers were on the same flight as Caro Quintero, chained, silent, finally on their way to American soil. When their lawyer found out, he called the transfer impossible because no Mexican judge had reviewed it. He was right. The Mexican government had used a national security loophole to bypass the entire judicial process. The lawyer's complaint went exactly nowhere. March 14th, 2025, the brothers were arraigned in Washington, D.C. federal court. The charges read like a war crimes indictment: continuing criminal enterprise, multiple murder conspiracies, machine gun use during drug trafficking, kidnapping, money laundering. They face up to life in prison. For the survivors of the 2011 ICE ambush, the moment was personal. Retired Homeland Security agent Victor Avila, who took bullets in that ambush while his partner Jaime Zapata died beside him, called it long overdue justice. He'd been waiting 14 years.
Now a major arrest involving a senior member of Mexico's Jalisco New Generation drug cartel. This is video of Audias Flores Silva being arrested by special forces from the Mexican Navy.
3 months after El Mencho died, the entire CJNG was scrambling to pick a new leader. 3 or 4 men were considered serious contenders. One of them was a guy nicknamed the Gardener. His real name was Audias Flores Silva. The aliases told you everything: Comandante, Bravo 2, Boss Killer. He'd already done 5 years in an American prison for drug trafficking as a young man. He came out hungrier. He spent the next 2 decades building one of the most profitable operations in CJNG: methamphetamine super labs in central Jalisco, fentanyl distribution corridors, even a timeshare scam that defrauded American and Canadian retirees out of millions. He'd been arrested in Mexico before, in 2016, for ambushing police. He spent 3 years in a maximum security prison. Then in 2019, a Jalisco court mysteriously absolved him and let him walk out the front door. Mexican reporters universally linked the release to a massive bribe. When El Mencho died in February 2026, El Jardinero was suddenly one of the most powerful men in Mexico. The U.S. State Department had a $5 million bounty on his head. The Mexican Navy had been tracking him since October 2024. And after El Mencho fell, the surveillance kicked into overdrive. American intelligence, those same Reaper drones, that same joint task force, was feeding location data straight to the Mexican Navy. April 25th, 2026, his exact location was confirmed, a cabin near the resort city of Puerto Vallarta. He was protected by 30 SUVs and more than 60 armed gunmen. He had escaped before. He thought he'd escape again. April 27th, dawn raid, 500 Mexican Navy troops, 6 helicopters, 4 planes. The cartel security perimeter scattered immediately, a deliberate distraction so the boss could escape. It had worked before. This time it didn't. Aerial trackers followed him to a sewage drainage pipe in a roadside ditch near a tiny community called El Mirador. The most powerful potential successor of El Mencho was hiding in a sewer. Mexican Marines reached down into the pipe and dragged him out. They didn't fire a single shot. The Mexican security secretary posted the video the same day. Flores Silva covered in dirt, hands behind his back, being walked to a helicopter. Hours later, his money launderer, a man called El Güero Conta, was arrested in Zapopan in a separate raid. In a single day, the CJNG lost its most likely successor and its principal financier. And he's now awaiting extradition to the United States, where federal prosecutors have been preparing his case since 2021. The gardener got pulled out of a sewer. There's no coming back from that.
El Viceroy. New video just into our newsroom tonight of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes being taken to a police helicopter. Carrillo Fuentes is a suspected leader of the Juarez drug cartel, one of Mexico's most wanted criminals, now behind bars in Mexico City.
For most of the 2000s, the deadliest city on earth was Ciudad Juarez, and one man was running it. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes was the younger brother of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the legendary Lord of the Skies, who built the Juarez cartel into the most powerful drug operation in Mexico. When Amado died in 1997, bizarrely, from complications during plastic surgery to change his face, Vicente took over. He inherited the most valuable trafficking corridor in the Western Hemisphere, the Ciudad Juarez to El Paso pipeline. Every gram of cocaine moving through that corner of the border was paying him a tax. The 2000s were a war. Vicente fought El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel for control of those routes, and the bodies piled up by the thousands. In just 3 months in early 2008, Ciudad Juarez recorded over 200 murders, headless corpses stuffed in barrels, bodies dumped in vacant lots, innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. The city's homicide rate became a global news story. At one point, Juarez was deadlier than active war zones. The FBI had been hunting Vicente since the year 2000. He had a $5 million U.S. bounty and a Mexican bounty of 30 million pesos. He changed his name, changed his face, moved to a quiet apartment in Torreon, Coahuila, and tried to disappear. October 9th, 2014, Mexican federal police kicked his door in. He didn't even fight. He pulled out a fake ID, claimed to be someone else. It didn't work. He was sentenced to 28 years in Mexican prison. The United States immediately filed for extradition. The request sat for over a decade until February 27th, 2025, when Vicente Carrillo Fuentes was on that same plane heading north. Brooklyn courtroom, same arraignment day as Caro Quintero. He pleaded not guilty to running a criminal enterprise, conspiracy, cocaine distribution, and money laundering. His lawyers tried for a plea deal in June 2025 to spare him a life sentence. By early 2026, he was once again pleading not guilty as the case moved forward. The man who turned Ciudad Juarez into a graveyard is now an American defendant facing the rest of his life behind bars. If El Mencho was the public face of CJNG, his 2 older brothers were the bones of it, and they fell within 48 hours of each other. Antonio Oseguera Cervantes was the second oldest. He was born in 1958, 8 years before El Mencho, and back in 1983, when a young Mexican kid first watched Al Pacino in Scarface, he picked up a nickname that stuck for life: Tony Montana. Tony Montana ran the financial and weapons side of CJNG. He'd done time in American prisons in the late 1990s 1990s, he came back to Mexico, helped his little brother build the cartel, and operated as part of what local reporters called the Oseguera Triumvirate, 3 brothers running everything as a family business. Mexican Army raided him in Guadalajara in December 2022. He was held for over 2 years while the United States waited for extradition. February 27, 2025, Tony Montana was on the plane with the others, sent to face American justice on charges that could carry the death penalty. Less than 24 hours later, the third brother fell. Abraham Oseguera Cervantes, known as Don Rodo, was the oldest of the brothers, around 70 years old. He was the money man, the property man. He bought ranches and land for El Mencho through a network of corrupt notaries in Ciudad Guzman and Autlan de Navarro. His own wife, Virginia Leon Osornio, was laundering cartel cash through gold mines in Michoacan and Nayarit. Don Rodo had been arrested before April 2024. He spent exactly 9 days in custody before a federal judge let him walk, claiming insufficient evidence. It was the kind of release that made every Mexican news outlet roll its eyes. This time was different. February 28, 2025, Mexican Army, National Guard, Marines, and federal prosecutors descended on a tiny town called Atarjeas de Covarrubias in Jalisco. They caught Don Rodo with weapons, cash, and drugs. 3 CJNG bodyguards went down with him. Within 48 hours, both of El Mencho's brothers were behind bars. 1 year later, El Mencho himself was dead. The dynasty that built CJNG, 3 brothers from a tiny Michoacan village who started a cartel together, was completely dismantled. You couldn't write a more complete fall if you tried. The last man on our list is the man who paid for everything. Abigail Gonzalez Valencia was El Mencho's brother-in-law, married to El Mencho's sister-in-law, family, and while El Mencho was the muscle and the public face, El Queenie was the bank. He led an organization called Los Queenies, technically an armed wing of CJNG, but in reality, something far more important. They were the financial engine. They moved the money. They bought the hotels and the real estate firms and the shopping centers that laundered cartel profits across Mexico. The U.S. Treasury called Los Queenies one of the most powerful and violent drug cartels in Mexico. His own brother Jose was sentenced to 30 years in a Washington, D.C. federal court in mid-2025 for cocaine trafficking. El Queenie got arrested back in February 2015 in Puerto Vallarta. And then he did what every cartel boss does. He fought extradition. He hired lawyers. He filed appeals. He waited out the Americans. 10 years passed. He won every round. Then came the second wave, August 12th, 2025. Mexico transferred 26 more high-ranking cartel figures to the United States. It was the second mass transfer of the Trump era. Bigger pressure, more tariff threats, more designations. El Queenie was on that plane. He pleaded not guilty in his first hearing. Methamphetamine trafficking, cocaine trafficking, organized crime, firearms possession. But then the prosecutor started showing his lawyers what they had. Text messages between El Queenie and El Mencho, conversations with El Mencho's son Menchito, cocaine shipment logistics, pricing, debts, names. By October 2025, the hearing was postponed. The defense was negotiating a plea deal. The financial brain behind Mexico's most violent cartel was preparing to cooperate against the empire he funded. American prosecutors had reportedly built a wall of evidence against him. Text messages, financial records, witness testimony, and the man who had spent 10 years swearing he would never break suddenly had no cards left to play. For decades, El Mencho had been untouchable in Mexico. Now his death squad was decimated. His brothers were locked up. His potential successors were captured or dead. And his brother-in-law, the man who knew where every dollar went, was getting ready to talk. Is this the beginning of the end for the CJNG? There's only way to find out.